In the summer of 1971, in a horse arena in eastern Missouri, the birds began to fall, and how a whole town, 2,000 people, was wiped off the map and told last of anyone by a stranger on a telephone. Sparrows out of the rafters. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds, dead on the floor of a barn where nothing had changed except one thing. A few weeks earlier, a man had come with a tanker truck and sprayed the dirt floor of the arena to keep the dust down. Waste oil. Dark and slick. Everyone did it. It cost $150. The place was Shenandoah Stables. The woman who owned it was named Judy Piatt. After the birds came the cats. The stable kept a dozen of them. They died one after another. Then the dog. Then the horses. Not all at once. Over weeks and months they sickened and went down and had to be destroyed. Before it was over, the count would reach 62. And then Judy Piatt's daughter got sick, Andy, 6 years old. In August, she was taken to the Children's Hospital in St. Louis. She had lost half her body weight. She was bleeding inside. Nobody could say why. The health people came and took soil and took blood and went away, and for 3 years said nothing anyone could use. The oil that was sprayed on that arena floor did not come from nowhere. It came out of a tanker, mixed in a tank, and it went to other places too. Roads, parking lots, around 30 of them across eastern Missouri. And the biggest of them, 20-some miles away, was a whole town. A town that paid to have its streets sprayed with the same oil, from the same tanks, to hold down the same dust. The horses died in 1971. The town would not be told what was on its streets until the end of 1982, 11 years. And when the town was finally told, it was not the government that told it. It was a reporter, on the telephone, 2 weeks before a flood, at Christmas. This is the town they lost. It was called Times Beach. Town look, town newspaper, on Beach was a town a newspaper, the Times, was trying to sell subscriptions. So it bought a strip of land on the Merrimack River, about 17 miles southwest of the city, and cut it into 6,000 tiny lots, 20 feet wide, 100 feet deep, slivers of floodplain. The deal was this. For $67.50 you got a lot, and a 6-month subscription to the newspaper thrown in, $10 down, $250 a month. It was a beach resort in the beginning. People came out from the city to swim in the river and picnic on the sand. Route 66 came through in the 20s, and in 1932 a steel bridge, 1,000 feet of it, was thrown across the Merrimack to carry the highway past the town. A road like that makes a living for a place. A local historian of the highway, Joe Sonderman, put it simply. Route 66 gave people the chance to run gas stations and restaurants and businesses that served the travelers going by. But a resort built on a floodplain out of newspaper lots does not stay a resort. The Depression came, and people who had nowhere else to go looked at a 20-foot lot they already owned and built a small frame house on it and stayed the year round. Nobody planned Times Beach. It was a sales promotion that people moved into because they had run out of other options. And then it was a town, and then it was home, and then it was home for 60 years, so 2,000 people on the wrong side of a river on 20-foot lots. What was it actually like? The river ran along the north and the east of the town, and the river was where the children were. One of them was a boy named Frank Perler. He remembered airing an inner tube up at the gas station, laying a piece of foam across it, and floating the Merrimack on it all day. That was the summer. In the fall, there was the big game against Crescent. The next town over played in an empty lot because an empty lot was what they had, and in the winter, the street was the field. Residents remembered snowball fights that took in a whole block at a time. There was a ball diamond. The hometown team was called the Sons of the Beach. That diamond goes to weeds behind a government fence, and nothing is ever built on it again. Another man who grew up on those streets, Mike Capstick, put the whole of it into one sentence. He ran the streets with his buddies. They played ball. They chased pretty girls. It was a great city, he said. Mostly blue collar. It was blue collar. It was not poor, and it was not ashamed of itself. A lot of the men worked at the Chrysler plant down the highway. By the census of 1980, there were 2,041 people living in Times Beach, up from about 1,210 years before. The town was growing. There were 4 churches, and there were taverns, and there were family businesses with the family's name on the sign. Walk the length of the place and you pass Cash's Tavern and the White Way Food Market, and then down by the bridge the Roadhouse, Steiny's Inn. At Steiny's in those years, you could sit down to a steak dinner for $2.50. It was the kind of town where children grew up and married the person they had gone to high school with and did not leave. In the yards there were above-ground pools and pickups in the drives, and dogs on chains, and laundry out on the line. There will be a fence at the end of this street inside of 11 years, and men in white suits inside the fence. And the river flooded, not once in a lifetime, regularly. It was a floodplain, and everybody knew it was a floodplain, and Times Beach had a routine for it. When the water was coming, you put the furniture up on concrete blocks, and you got out for a day or two, and then you came back and cleaned up and carried on. That is a town that knows how to survive the thing it is built next to. There was one problem Times Beach could never solve, and it had nothing to do with the river. Its roads, 23 miles of them, and almost none of them paved. The town could not afford the paving, and an unpaved road in a hot Missouri summer is a machine for making dust. Dust on the laundry, dust on the porches, dust in the houses, dust in the children's lungs, dust standing gold in the light every time a car went by. The town wanted its dust gone. That want is what killed it. In 1972, Times Beach found a cheap answer to its dust. You could hire a man with a tanker to spray your roads with waste oil. The oil soaked the dust down and held it, and it was far cheaper than paving. Towns did it. Farmers did it. Horse arenas did it. The man Times Beach hired was a waste oil hauler named Russell Bliss. The price for the whole town, all 23 miles, was $2,400. And it worked. A tanker came, slowed down the gravel, laying a dark, wet, oily sheen across the road, and the dust stopped rising. The oil dried to a hard shine. The children rode their bikes through the fresh sheen and drew lines in it with sticks. One woman who was a child there, Donna Pollard Branson, remembered running on those oiled roads barefoot. People were glad. They had wanted this for years. Bliss sprayed the town over about 4 years, from 1972 into 1976. In all, he laid down something like 160,000 gallons of oil on the roads of Times Beach. He was not, by his own account, a chemist. When regulators later asked him how he knew what was in his tanks, he told them his tests were simple. He would sometimes taste it or put a drop on a napkin and see whether it would burn. He had a phrase for what was in the oil. He called it, in his words, BS and water. He would say later that he never believed the oil was dangerous, and he would ask a question that was, in its way, unanswerable. If he had thought it was something bad, why would he spray it on his own farm, where his own family lived? He did spray it on his own farm. He believed it was crankcase oil, used motor oil, nothing worse. He was wrong. And to understand how wrong, you have to follow the oil back up the pipe to a chemical plant in a small town called Verona. Verona, Missouri is a small town in the southwest of the state. In the 1960s, it had a chemical plant run by a company called Hoffman Taff. The plant made a weed killer. Its name was 2,4,5-T. If you have heard of it, it is probably under another name, because 2,4,5-T was one of the 2 main ingredients of Agent Orange, the defoliant the American military sprayed over the jungles of Vietnam. Making that chemical leaves waste behind, a thick residue in the bottom of the reaction vessels. The workers called it still bottoms, and in those still bottoms, formed as an accident of the chemistry, was a contaminant. Its name is tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, TCDD, dioxin. At the time, reporters would call it the most toxic chemical ever made by man. That was the language of the era, and the science of low doses is more argued now than it was then, but nobody, then or now, has called it safe. In 1969, another company with a long name, usually shortened to Nipaxo, leased part of the Verona plant to make an ingredient for soap and disinfectant. Its process made dioxin waste too, and that waste, the still bottoms, sat in a storage tank at Verona, and eventually it had to go somewhere. Follow the chain. Nipaxo hired a company called Independent Petrochemical to get rid of the waste. Independent Petrochemical did not do the hauling itself. It hired a subcontractor, a man with tanker trucks and a waste oil business. Russell Bliss. In 1971, Bliss hauled about 18,500 gallons of that dioxin waste out of Verona, 6 truckloads of it, and mixed it into his tanks of used motor oil. And then he went out and sprayed it on arenas, on roads, on the streets of a town. There was no law then that made him keep a record of any of it. The federal law that would require it did not exist until 1976. So from his side, there is no paper, no manifest, nothing. The paper came from somewhere else. It came from a mother with a horse farm. Go back to Judy Piatt and her dead horses and her sick child. The health people had come to Shenandoah stables in the summer of 1971 and taken their samples and left. No answer came. The animals kept dying. Her daughter came home from the hospital alive, but the family stayed sick. So Judy Piatt decided to find out for herself where the poison had come from, and what she did next is the reason we know any of this. She and her business partner, a man named Frank Hempel, began to follow Russell Bliss's trucks. For more than a year, they tailed the tankers around eastern Missouri, writing down where they went and what they sprayed. To keep from being recognized, they wore disguises. Hempel in a woman's wig, Piatt in a man's cowboy hat, a mother and her partner in costume chasing oil trucks because no one whose job it was would do it. And out of that year of following, Judy Piatt built a document, 18 pages, typed. It named 16 companies whose waste Bliss had hauled. It listed 31 places he had sprayed it. One of the places on her list was Times Beach. In 1972, she handed that report to the government, not to one agency, to 3, to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, to the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, to the Missouri Department of Health. As early as 1972, a private citizen had done the investigating, named the sprayer, listed the poison places, put Times Beach in writing, and delivered it into the files of 3 separate government bodies. The list of where the poison was existed, in triplicate, in government hands. A full decade before the town on that list was told a word. This is the document the whole story turns on, not a corporate memo, not a sealed file. A mother's 18 typed pages warning the state about the very town it would evacuate 11 years later. It was read and filed, and nothing was done with it. And the paper trail was only beginning. For 3 years after the horses died, the government could not say what had killed them. The samples went to the laboratories of the Centers for Disease Control, and the answer did not come quickly. When it came, it was exact. On the 30th of July, 1974, the CDC identified the poison in the soil of the Shenandoah Arena. It was dioxin, TCDD, and the amount was staggering, more than 30 parts per million. The level of concern the government would eventually set for dioxin in soil was 1 part per billion. The arena Judy Piatt had sprayed for $150 was carrying dioxin at tens of thousands of times what would later be judged the line of safety. So by the summer of 1974, the government knew the name of the poison, knew how strong it was, and held, in its files, a citizen's list of where else it had been sprayed, including a town of 2,000 people. And then, in 1975, came the mistake that bought everyone 8 quiet years. The CDC told the state of Missouri that dioxin in soil would break down quickly, that its half-life, the time for half of it to disappear, was about 1 year. If that were true, then the problem would solve itself. Wait a few years, and the poison would fade out of the ground on its own. There would be nothing to clean up, and nothing to warn anyone about. It was not true. The real half-life of dioxin in soil is not 1 year. It is closer to a decade, and by some measures longer. The poison was not fading. It was sitting in the roads of Times Beach, in the arena at Shenandoah, in 30 other places, staying almost exactly as strong as the day it was sprayed, while children rode bikes over it, and the government waited for it to go away. On the strength of one wrong number, everyone waited. By the end of the 1970s, the government was no longer only holding a mother's report. It was building a file of its own. In October of 1979, the EPA got an anonymous tip. It came from a former employee of Napaxo, the company that had made the dioxin waste at Verona. The tipster said the waste had been dumped on a farm. Investigators went and asked questions. They interviewed something like 25 people about what Napaxo had done with its waste. And in the spring of 1980, they went out to a place called the Denny Farm, and they dug. They pulled some 85 drums out of the ground. So now the federal government held the whole chain end to end. It knew about the plant at Verona. It knew about the waste. It knew about the hauler. It had drums in its hands. And in March of 1982, the EPA formally obtained the CDC's old dioxin records, the soil results, the identification, the list of sites. Every piece was now in one place. The name of the chemical, the name of the man who sprayed it, the names of the places he sprayed it, Times Beach among them, going back to Judy Piatt's pages 10 years before. Everything needed to warn the town was in a federal file by the spring of 1982. The town was not warned in the spring of 1982. It would be warned in November, and the warning would not come through any of the doors it should have come through. It would come sideways, by accident, because someone leaked a piece of paper the government meant to keep to itself. In the fall of 1982, an internal EPA document got out. It was a list, a confidential list, inside the agency, of the dioxin sites in Missouri. 14 of them confirmed. 41 more suspected, a working map of where the poison was known or thought to be. Times Beach was on it. The list reached an environmental group, the Environmental Defense Fund, and through them it reached the press. And a reporter holding that page with the name of the town on it picked up a telephone. The phone that rang was in the office of the Times Beach city clerk. That call was how the town found out. Not a knock on the door from the EPA. Not a letter from the state health department that had held Judy Piatt's report for 10 years. Not the agency that had dug up the drums, or named the chemical, or drawn up the list. A reporter on the phone asking the city clerk of a town of 2,000 people for a comment on the news that their streets were poisoned. And the clerk not knowing what the reporter was talking about because no one had ever told the town anything. The people of Times Beach said, afterward, exactly what you would expect people to say. That they felt betrayed, that the government had known and had never told them. They were right. The government had known. For years. It is all there in the timeline, in the government's own records. The report in 72. The name of the chemical in 74. The drums in 80. The records pulled into one file in the spring of 82. And the town heard it last of anyone, from a stranger with a leaked page in November of 1982. That is the document. Not because it was hidden in a vault, because it did its damage precisely by being kept quiet in the ordinary files of the people whose job was to speak. The town had 2 weeks to take the news in. Then the river came. The EPA finished taking its soil samples in Times Beach on the 3rd of December 1982. The next day it started to rain. Now this town knew floods. The furniture went up on the concrete blocks the way it always had, and people got ready to sit it out for a day or two and come back and clean up. The Merrimack rose and rose, and then broke its banks. It was a record flood, the worst the valley had seen, more than 20 feet above flood stage. The whole town went under. The river Frank Perler had floated on an inner tube went over the roofs of the houses. The routine did not work this time. Nothing they had ever done for a flood was any use against this one. People fled in the dark, in pickups and in john boats, out to the raised shoulder of Interstate 44, and stood there and watched the water climb over the rooftops of their houses. And here is the cruelty of the timing. The flood did not only drown the town, it stirred the poison and spread it. The dioxin was in the roads. The flood lifted the contaminated mud off the roads and carried it everywhere the water went, into the yards, under the houses, through the ground floors of homes people would within weeks be told they could never live in again. So the two disasters of Times Beach happened in the same fortnight, on top of each other. The town learned it was poisoned in the middle of November. The town drowned at the start of December. And the flood took the poison the town had just learned about and mixed it into everything the water touched. When the water went down, the residents began to think about going home and cleaning up and drying out and starting again the way they always had. They were not going to be allowed to go home. The answer to that came on the day before Christmas Eve. On the 23rd of December, 1982, the CDC and the Missouri Division of Health announced the results of the soil testing. The dioxin in the roads of Times Beach was running at around 100 parts per billion, and in places up to 300. The level the CDC considered a cause for concern was 1. The town was contaminated at 100 to 300 times the line of concern, and the flood had just spread it through people's homes. And so the recommendation came from the CDC's Dr. Vernon Hoke, the director of its Center for Environmental Health. It was blunt and it was simple. The people of Times Beach should not go back. The town should not be lived in again. It is the day before Christmas Eve. The town is under a foot of drying river mud. Families are scattered in motels and with relatives, waiting to go home and salvage what is left of the holidays. And they are told instead that home is gone, that the ground itself is against them, that the place they have just watched drown is a place they can never live in again. 2 weeks earlier, they had not known there was anything wrong with their streets. Now the year was ending with a government doctor telling them to stay away from their own houses. The children of Times Beach would remember that this was the Christmas they did not go home. And while all of this was happening to a small town in Missouri, 700 miles away in Washington, the agency that had held the files was coming apart. To understand why Times Beach blew up when it did, you have to look at Washington in the winter of 1982. The EPA was in the worst scandal of its short life. The agency ran a program called Superfund, the money set aside to clean up the country's worst toxic sites, and Congress had come to believe the program was being run corruptly, that polluters were being let off with sweetheart deals, that decisions were being made for political reasons, that records were being withheld, and worse. In December of 1982, the head of the EPA, Ann Gorsuch-Burford, refused to hand over Superfund documents to Congress. For that, the House of Representatives voted to cite her for contempt of Congress. She was the first head of a federal agency in the history of the United States to be cited for contempt. 6 separate congressional committees dug into the agency. They found evidence of destroyed and missing documents, shredded files, papers that had left the building. The head of the Superfund program herself, a woman named Rita Lavelle, was fired in February of 1983 and was later convicted of lying to Congress under oath. She went to prison for it. More than 20 senior officials left the agency before the scandal was done, and it was into the middle of that storm that Times Beach fell. Because Times Beach was exactly the thing Congress was worried about. A poison town the government had known about for years, kept quiet. The buyout of Times Beach was announced by Ann Gorsuch-Burford herself on the 22nd of February, 1983. She flew to Missouri to do it in the last weeks before her own resignation. As St. Louis Magazine later reconstructed the scene, she made the announcement from a locked conference room in a hotel near the town, while hundreds of residents stood outside and listened to her voice come through loudspeakers. Stand out there with them for a second. On the far side of that locked door, a woman who has been cited for contempt of Congress is deciding the future of your town, and you are hearing it the way you heard everything else, secondhand, through a speaker, after the fact. One of the 2,000 people that voice was talking about was Marilyn Leisner, who would become the last mayor of Times Beach and would spend her whole term presiding over its end. Burford resigned about 2 weeks later. The town on the leaked list had become the national example of everything the agency had done wrong. The government decided to do something it had never done before. It decided to buy the whole town and empty it and be rid of it. On the 7th of January 1983, President Reagan set up a task force for Times Beach, pulling together the EPA, the CDC, the disaster agency FEMA, and the Army Corps of Engineers. And on the 22nd of February, the plan was announced. The federal government would pay $33 million of an estimated $36.7 million buyout. The state of Missouri would cover the rest. The money came out of Superfund. The relocation was run through FEMA, the same agency that handled floods and hurricanes. In all, the buyout covered 800 homes and 30 businesses. By 1985, more than 2,000 people had been moved out of Times Beach and scattered across the St. Louis suburbs and beyond. The offers were at what the government called fair market value. To people whose whole worth was in a small frame house on a 20-foot lot, fair market value was very little. One house, residents recalled, was appraised at $15,800. It is a life. Take George and Lorene Klein, an older couple who did not want to go, who held out after almost everyone else had signed and gone. What they were fighting over was not a line on a government table. It was the front room they had grown old in, the yard, the whole of what they had. And when they took it to court, the court valued it at even less than the government had offered. You could not argue with the government's arithmetic, and you could not stay. The town was being closed, whether you agreed or not. In the same weeks the town was being emptied 20-some miles away, the woman who had warned him 11 years early was being paid off. Judy Piatt had been at this for 11 years. 62 horses, a 6-year-old who lost half her body weight, 18 typed pages handed to 3 government agencies in 1972, and nothing back from any of them. What she got, in the end, was money. $100,000 from Independent Petrochemical in 1976, and in 1983, in the same weeks the moving trucks were working the streets of Times Beach, Independent Petrochemical paid $1 million to each of her daughters. The government's price for a house in Times Beach was $15,800. The company's price for what had been done to one of Judy Piatt's daughters was $1 million. In January of that same year, with Times Beach on front pages across the country, a wire story ran carrying Judy Piatt's own words about what had happened to her in that barn at 6 years old. 4 of them. Dioxin almost killed me. She was right, and she had been right for 12 years, and nobody had done anything with the pages her mother typed. The people leaving Times Beach got no settlement and no answer. What they got was a word: Dioxin. It followed them out. They had become, in the newspapers and in the minds of their new neighbors, Dioxin people. Contaminated. Something to keep away from. Residents remembered it in small ways. Children from Times Beach, they recalled, seated apart from the others at their new schools, as if what they had might be catching. A dry cleaner who would not take a flood-damaged jacket once he heard where it came from. A whole town treated, quietly, as unclean. The last mayor of Times Beach was Marilyn Leisner. She took the job in the middle of the crisis in 1983 and held it to the end, presiding over the closing of her own town. Her family carried the kind of illness the residents could never get the government to blame on the dioxin, and could never get it to rule out either. 4 of her children developed thyroid disorders. 1 daughter had cancer and endometriosis. Whether the town did that to them, no study ever proved, and no study ever cleared. Marilyn Leisner said one thing that stands for all of it. She said that everything that was near and dear to the people of that community, everything they did not carry out with them, everything left behind in their homes, was buried there. She meant it almost literally, because the government was not only going to empty Times Beach, it was going to erase it. They dissolved it. In the spring of 1985, on the 2nd of April, the state of Missouri disincorporated Times Beach. An order signed by the governor, John Ashcroft, dissolved the city government. A town that had legally existed for 60 years, that still had streets and houses and a name on the map, simply stopped being a town in the eyes of the state. There was almost no one left in it to notice. The houses stood empty behind a fence with warning signs for years. The ball diamond went to weeds. The streets Russell Bliss had sprayed sat there in the sun and the rain, empty. And they demolished it by around 1992. The houses and the shops of Times Beach were gone, knocked flat, and then they burned the ground itself. In 1995, the government built an incinerator on the site of the town, not near it, on it. And from 1996 to 1997, that incinerator burned 265,000 tons of dioxin-contaminated soil and debris, gathered from 27 sites across eastern Missouri. The 137,000 tons of that was the ground of Times Beach itself, its own poisoned soil, fed through a furnace. And with it went what was left of the town, the rubble of the houses. Even the water tower is said to have gone through the cleanup. A town invented by a newspaper, poisoned by a hauler, found out by a reporter, drowned by a river, emptied by the government, dissolved by the state, and finally passed through fire, so that the very earth it had stood on was burned. To clean up all of it cost well over $100 million, paid largely by Syntex, the company that had ended up owning the Verona plant's liabilities under a court-approved settlement. And when the fire was out, they planted grass. Where Times Beach was, there is now a park. In 1999, the state opened Route 66 State Park on the 419 acres where the town had stood. There are trails and picnic shelters and a boat ramp on the Merrimack. On a summer day, people ride bikes there, the way children once rode bikes on the oiled roads, and most of them have no idea what is under the grass, because the town is still there, in a way. The incinerated soil, cleaned and capped, lies under a grassed mound in the park. You can walk over the place where 2,000 people lived, and it is a low green hill now. There is one other thing people notice out there. In the spring, lilies still come up in the flat grass, in clusters, in the shapes of the yards they were planted in. And one building from Times Beach still stands, the old roadhouse by the river. The Bridgehead Inn, built in 1935, the place they knew as Steenie's. The $2.50 steak dinner. It is the park's visitor center now, with a small exhibit about the town that used to be here. The old Route 66 bridge over the Merrimack still stands too, but it is closed and rusting and waiting on a restoration. Ben McCark, maimed for the road, not the town, because the town's name was not something anyone wanted on a sign anymore. And here, at the end, is the part that has never been settled. In May of 1991, Dr. Vernon Hook, the same CDC official whose recommendation had emptied Times Beach 8 years before, stood up and changed his mind. He told the Washington Post that, on the later science of dioxin, it appeared the evacuation had been unnecessary, that Times Beach, in his own word, had been an overreaction. It is one of the most quoted second thoughts in the history of American environmental policy. The man who ordered the town emptied, saying the town need not have been emptied. But keep three things in view before you decide he was right. The first is where he said it. St. Louis Magazine tied the remark to an appearance at a convention sponsored by Syntex, the company that was paying for the cleanup, and had every reason to want the panic called an overreaction. The second is that the science did not stay on his side. In 1997, the International Cancer Agency of the World Health Organization classified this dioxin as a Group 1 human carcinogen, known to cause cancer in people. Not suspected, known. And the third is the plainest. In December of 1982, with the town flooded. Gata Tuhle. That was greater, and the poison spread through people's homes at 100 to 300 times the level of concern. With the science that existed at that moment, a public health official had to choose. He told the people to stay away, whether that was too much caution or exactly the right amount is an argument that has run for 40 years and will run for 40 more. The studies never did settle it. They never conclusively tied anyone's illness to the town, and they never quite cleared it either. The Piatt family and the Leisner family carried their sickness into old age with no verdict from anyone. So here is where it leaves us. Maybe the ground at Times Beach would have killed people, and maybe it would not have. That question is still open, and honest people still argue it, and this film is not going to close it because it cannot. But that was never the real wound. The real wound is in the calendar. The horses died in 1971. A woman named Judy Piatt named the poison and the places, Times Beach among them. In 18 typed pages she handed to 3 government agencies in 1972. The government put the exact name to the chemical in 1974. It dug up the drums in 1980. It pulled all the records into one file in the spring of 1982. And the town found out in November of 1982 from a reporter on the telephone, holding a page it was never supposed to see. 11 years. Everything known, and the people who lived on top of it told last, and by accident. Judy Piatt died in 2013. Her own account of it was published after her death under the title she gave it, Killing Horses. In all those years, no agency ever went back to the 18 pages and did anything with them. Whether or not the soil was ever going to kill them, the way they were told meant the town was already finished the moment that phone rang in the clerk's office. You cannot unknow that your government held the answer for a decade and let you drive your children over it. Times Beach is a green mound and a closed bridge and one old roadhouse by a river now. A town and newspaper invented for $67.50, and the country burned to the ground and planted over. The overreaction, if it was one, was about the poison in the soil. And the silence is the only part nobody has ever had to answer for.